Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 13th of July. We have some really important developments all across the front line, beginning with the capture of Urozhaine by the Russian forces, then looking at further Russian advances into Novoselivka Persha. We'll look at some interesting developments with tanks getting involved in the battles within the suburbs of Toretsk, and we'll finish off with additional infiltrations into Makiivka. So as I said, Urozhaine is the first on the chopping block. And so we're going to see how the Russian forces were able to advance through this village in rather quick succession. And so I'm going to change the marking of the village from gray zone, which is basically what I use for my black marker, and turn it into a red marker to indicate Russian control in this region. So in yesterday's video, we discussed how the Russian forces were able to advance past their initial positions in this foothold within the warehouses and the southernmost houses of the hamlet. And we saw this with this geolocation here from July 12th, where the Russian forces were able to raise flags in some of the duplexes. And since then, the Ukrainians actually did try to organize some sort of counterattack consisting of at least one tank, but it was destroyed by a Russian FPV from the Vostok group. And so it does appear that there were some attempts by the Ukrainian garrison here to muster their forces and repel the Russian assault. But simply due to the momentum the Russians already had pushing through these houses one by one, they were able to capture it in its entirety. And this happened over the course of the 12th and the 13th of July based on the publicly available footage. So here, for instance, we have a video from July 12th. And this is a video from the Ukrainian Bulava drone unit, which is affiliated with the 3rd Mechanized Battalion, which you see over here, of the Separate Presidential Brigade. This is a very important point because this is the only battalion of this particular brigade that is still operating in the Velika Novosilka sector, because all the other battalions in the unit have been moved elsewhere, whether it be to areas around Bakhmut, for instance. That's where they're the most present. But, this unit has served in many different capacities, and so it has really not been cohesive for a while now, which means less manpower diverted towards this part of the front line, which again makes it easier for the Russian forces to find gaps and harder for the Ukrainians to hold the line. And it's not just this unit. There are various other units that have been over the past year diverted away from the sector. We could go into listing them, but I did in my last video. But I will just say, for instance, since we talked about a tank right now, the 1st Tank Brigade is not fully committed to this part of the front line, but there are still tank elements here. And so this is one of the few regions where you see tank engagements every now and then. And really, besides that, this sector consists of rather small, less trained, or generally more independent units. So I'm talking about drone groups. Here you actually have a transport brigade. You have this 58th Motorized Brigade, which is also committed to areas further eastwards, not fully to this part of the front line. And then just territorial defense units. And that's about it. And so the Russian forces, they do have a rather large advantage in terms of manpower, both in terms of their quantity, but also quality, because these are the same units that had experience fighting in Urozhaine last year when the Ukrainians conducted their counteroffensive, and in August of 2023 actually captured the village. It's been 11 months since then, and some of the same units are now involved in recapturing it. So they really do have in-depth knowledge into the sort of dynamics in the village, and yeah, they know all the minutiae. And so we're talking about, for instance, the Kaskad Battalion. There was Vostok group that we talked about. You have specifically the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade. They were involved in the main spearhead to push all the way to the northern part of the village. And then you have the 37th Brigade of the 36th Combined Arms Army. That army that I just mentioned, they're the main sort of force that is present in this general theater that spans the Donetsk and Zaporozhye border in this region. And so let's just look at some of the other geolocations. Here is one again, Russian forces raising a flag in a building in central Urozhaine. And you can see this one's from July 13th. And so there are a few larger structures that the Russians were able to capture, get under their control. And you had a very gradual throughout the day or two. So it's not really that gradual. But, they went one by one and searched through the basements, trying to clear them out. And that's when the Ukrainian drone crews that were able to make it to the front line spotted them and tried targeting those same troops. And very recently, the 40th Brigade, as we just talked about, they released footage from the northern end of Urozhaine, showing them raising their unit flag in the remains. And they showed this overhead view of the entire village, showing that it's not totally decimated, which is insane to think about because there's already been 3 battles within Urozhaine over the course of over a year. But nonetheless, there are still some ruins that are standing, the skeletons of structures, and that's where you have a lot of the troops that fought, and those are the areas that they sought cover in, and of course also in dugouts that were basically built from really nothing in some cases or extended out of several basements. And so now you have the Russian forces turning this into a forward lodging point, and in the process getting control over the Ukrainian line of defense. This very, very narrow line of defense control. Basically, the point of this was in order to control the entrance into Urozhaine. And so now the Russians have control over that particular system. And they also have access to this vertical road that leads further northwards all the way into other villages that are near the Wonkuriali River, like Blaudatne, and as you go further north, all the way back to Velika Novoselivka. And so let's look at the importance of this capture. What this means is the Russian forces have been able to straighten the front line following their capture of Staromaiorske, and they now have a rather large node for further attacks to springboard on both sides of the river, because you do have these parallel roads that are advancing northwards into the Velika Novoselivka city. And at the same time, it means the Ukrainians were forced to abandon some of their very important dugouts and heights that are located just east of Urozhaine in this region over here. It's just not feasible for them to have control over it after the Russian advance just directly to its western flank. And so now marking this region as a gray zone until we get confirmation of Russians being able to clear out that area. But that region that I just marked with X is really important, because let's mark it with a sort of rectangle here so you guys understand. This region in particular is located on a ridge that overlooks the entire river valley where the center of the fighting is located. That includes areas under Russian and Ukrainian control alike. So it has a dual benefit for the Russians when they have it under their control. First of all, they neuter any sort of Ukrainian efforts to target the Russian rear. And then the Russians have the ability to then fire onto Ukrainians that are reaching the line of contact and turn it into some sort of fire pocket whenever they're defending near the floodplains. And so now you have this ability for the Russians to organize larger attacks using this road over here, using their infantry to push from Urozhaine and solidify control over additional parts of this ridge. And that ridge really would be monumental in getting control over the southern flank of Velika Novoselivka and then directly firing into it. And that is the main, I guess, coordination point for the entire Ukrainian garrison in this region for several thousand soldiers. And then looking further westwards, we already talked about this, but there's still this ridge that extends from within Russian control into the Ukrainian side of the front line, which the Russians are utilizing to overlook areas like Makiivka, Urozhaine, and Skuchnia. And so you could see a scenario wherein all of these Ukrainian frontline villages, which are rather small, and so it does also have a benefit for Ukraine in that the fighting becomes very concentrated in a narrow region, which to a certain extent neuters the Russian sort of advantage in manpower, but only to a certain extent. And then that puts the Ukrainians defending here in really grave danger, especially as the Russians could move their forward artillery and mortars closer and closer to key villages. We could see that happening in an area like Makiivka, which could become a forward firing point. So just in conclusion, we can see that over the past 2 days since my last video, the Russian forces have been able to advance throughout this village 1.85 kilometers, which again does indicate that the Ukrainians may not have put in their entire wherewithal in the sector to try to maintain control over it. But then again, maybe that could just be reflective of their sort of defensive abilities in this particular region, given all the circumstances, given how they were flanked and overlooked from both sides, given how, again, despite some of the narrowness and some of the sort of unitary nature of the Russian advance through only one vector, the fact that they were outnumbered and outgunned, that definitely played a role. Looking at the Vavcha River front, we're going to begin by quickly looking at Yazoberdivka, an area that the Russians were able to reach at least the southern portion in late June. This happened due to the Russians capturing Natalove. They were able to advance through the vertical road and then take this detour to the west and dismount forces in rather small amounts, so it wasn't any sort of massive mechanized assault, but you did have some protected vehicles reaching all the way into the southern Manishin, and troops made their presence known there, but they were of course targeted by the Ukrainian drone crews and infantry that remained steadfast in controlling Yazoberdivka, because it serves as a sort of connecting bridge between the Ukrainian front line here and then the Karlivka Reservoir and crossing. And so they didn't want to give up the entire bridgehead at that point in time. And there is a good possibility that in between late June and mid July, the Russian forces were no longer present in this part of Yazor and they sort of withdrew eastwards and tried to regroup and tried to conduct a more fresh assault. And now we're seeing that the Russian forces have re-entered some of these regions. And so this is not the correct geolocation. I think it's this one over here from July 13th. It's just a video, or a quick snippet from Ukrainian source of a Russian soldier raising a flag in the notorious mansion in Yazor, which again confirms that the Russian forces have reactivated fighting here. And in terms of what remains under Ukrainian control, there aren't many massive structures. It really is just an assortment of trenches. And then it just connects to this tributary over here, branching out of the wider Vovcha River. And so it is a very narrow place to defend. And then there's a question about how many Ukrainian troops are even here at this point, whether it's just a few squads coming up against Russian forces that are beginning to envelop them from the south and also have positions directly east and north, which does spell trouble for the Ukrainian garrison that still remains east of the Karlivka Reservoir in this particular region. Now looking at Novoselivka Persha, we have two new geolocations confirming Russian advances. The first one is south of the village. It's an FPV strike from the Ukrainian side. So again, this should remind us the Ukrainians are heavily relying on FPV drones to act as a means by which to target Russian soldiers. Less artillery. I do know that Russian sources are claiming that the Ukrainians did move in some 155mm howitzers to target advancing Russian squads in the sector. But the vast majority of the videos I'm seeing are just FPV strikes, which also makes the most sense because basically the means by which Russia advanced here was through individual soldiers or very small squads pushing through tree lines, pushing through fields, and just pushing one by one. And a lot of the time, the Ukrainians aren't prepared to push them back. They don't even notice them until it's too late. And so you need to use FPVs to just specifically hit a single soldier, and it's more economical at that point and takes less time to reload and all that. You could use it at more of a large scale. And so here you have a video of an FPV strike on a Russian soldier who was just sort of sitting over here near this road next to the tree line, or at least what remains of it, because in some of these regions, a lot of the foliage has been lost. Wherever it isn't lost, the Russian forces really do have a field day with their advances, and they use it as their main outlet of entering into villages. What this confirms to us is a Russian advance amounting to, about 1 kilometer westwards, and it's through an area that is very important if the Ukrainians are to try to continue resisting in Novoselivka Persha, because what this could spell is another Russian flanking attempt, this time by advancing in the fields to the south. And these fields between Persha and Umanske, they are on a hill that not only looks over Novoselivka Persha, which is just in a really bad position topographically speaking, but it also overlooks some of the villages that the Ukrainians have westwards that we aren't discussing yet, but we will begin discussing following the fall of Novoselivka Persha. And so, of course, a lot of these yellow strongholds that you see built by the Ukrainians, they are generally located on the hills near the western bank of the river. But then when you look at the gaps in between them, those are areas that are on relatively low elevation. And it makes sense why there would be a priority on building the defenses on heights. You want to maintain control of them and maximize their lethal potential. But then you look at some other villages here like Mezhove, Komishivka, Tiche, Skuchnie. All these villages are basically just an extension of the Vovcha River in terms of their elevation. And they're on these low-lying streams that extend out of the river. And so naturally, they're also going to be a part of the same floodplain. And so those areas are also on rather low elevation. It is overlooked by the fields that are located within this X mark that are either under Russian control or will be under Russian control, or regions that the Ukrainians still maintain control of just south of Novoselivka Persha. And so that also has a future use in trying to target some of those Ukrainian squads that will be operating within frontline villages, trying to degrade their defensive capacity. But in any case, it means the Russians are also closing in on this village from the south. We also know that based on this geolocation from July 13th, there are Ukrainian drone crews dropping grenades onto houses in eastern Novoselivka Persha, confirming that there's not only a northeastern vector from Novopokrovsk, but there's also a direct Russian assault, as the Russians were able to enter into the village, get control over this warehouse and some of the first houses here along the streets. through one of these gullies over here, through some nearby tree lines, and that's how the individual soldiers made their way. And so the Ukrainians spotted them and targeted them in one of these houses. Again, confirmation of the Russians closing in on several vectors. We also have a few videos that essentially serve as confirmation footage to back up a lot of the recent claims that I've been making. And it's not like I'm making them up, I'm just reporting on some of the stuff that is coming out of Russian and Ukrainian sources alike. But this is from July 12th. It shows an individual Russian soldier in the crossroads between Sokil and Makiivka. And this is during the process of the Russians clearing it up. And in this case, there were 3 soldiers of the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade hiding within one of the houses here. And so the individual soldier threw grenades in, and the Russian side claims that they were able to kill 2. And the third one came out and surrendered. And this is again a confirmation that there was house-to-house fighting in this region, with the Ukrainians trying to bog down the Russians with whatever frontline soldiers they had in this region. And it also shows the Russians actually are present here, which confirms that there were further advances even westwards into Makiivka and other trenches here. And looking a bit further north, we have this video from July 12th. It comes from a Russian news report that's mainly focused on issues surrounding Donetsk and the citizens that are living in Horlivka and the city of Donetsk. But then it shows at the end this very brief snippet where there's a Russian mechanized assault. I think it's one particular Russian armored personnel carrier. It's pretty quickly advancing through the field and firing westwards towards Ukrainian positions in Urozhaine, and so is geolocated to this region, and serves as additional confirmation that there is a Russian push here, and now maybe we're seeing more vehicles get involved as the Russian forces try to turn Novoselivka and the hill just south of it into forward operating nodes for the Russians to continue their expansion in the northwestern direction, as I talked about extensively over the past 2 videos. Now, looking at the Toretsk sector, we do have a really important geolocation which helps us get an understanding of where the battlefield could really shift in the coming weeks. And so there has been some form of stabilization in the sense that for the past 4 days, I'd say, there hasn't been a massive development, for instance, in New York, vertically speaking, into the center of New York, which isn't that surprising. And obviously, things could change in the near future, depending on the way that the Russian momentum continues, or depending on the sort of attrition rates for whatever Ukrainian defenders have been sent into this region. But it's not too unsurprising because the Ukrainian forces did actually send in a sufficient amount of reinforcements, at least for the very short term, based on what I'm seeing. And that's something that at the beginning of July, I raised alarms about. The fact that there wasn't any publicly available information about a large amount of Ukrainian brigades being rediverted. And so now we're seeing the Ukrainians actually did heed those concerns and send in reinforcements in the thousands. And it's not just like 1 or 2,000, it's a much more substantial amount, not like 10,000, but something that is in between 1 to 10,000. I'd say that if we're looking at it, it could be in the ballpark of 6,000, 7,000, just my quick, uneducated guess. But nonetheless, that's something that definitely does play a role in maintaining control of certain key points like the center of New York. But it isn't enough to fully stop the Russian momentum, even in an area like the Toretsk suburbs. And so to be more specific, the Russian forces were able to push through the northern area of Pivdenia, which is located on an important height, and they advanced through the eastern portion of the suburbs of Lizhny. They got control over parts of this apartment complex where they've not gotten bogged down due to the Ukrainians sending in frontline soldiers from the Liut, at least one battalion from the Liut brigade to engage in frontline combat, and they'll send in tanks from the 32nd Mechanized Brigade to just get involved in firing directly towards the Russians. And so now the front line is stalled over there. Same thing looking further north. There has been a bit of a stall as the Russian forces have reached these forested regions or into the direct houses in Pivnishnya and Druzhba, which does happen once you enter into an urban nature, as we saw in Vovchansk, for instance, especially in the face of fresh, or you won't say fresh even, but new reinforcements into this region. But we do actually have an advance in this region that occurred today, actually. And it's a Russian advance of about 800, 900 meters in the southwest. And what I mean by saying that it's from today is that there was a video released by the 32nd Tank Brigade where they fired towards the Russian infantry in houses within the western portions of Zalizhnia. And so we already knew that this district over here was under Russian control, but it appears that at some point this week, the Russian forces were able to expand control, cross over this sort of field that's a couple hundred meters, spans, reach into some of the duplexes, some of the larger structures, and then into some of the private residential houses here. And as a result, they were able to establish this foothold in a region that is really important topographically, but also when you look at the dynamics of the front line. So first of all, if we're looking at elevation, and I've talked about this a lot, but to remind you guys, I'm marking this in green. This is generally the region where there's high elevation in the Toretsk suburbs, and it's something that I'm marking for you guys in, I guess I'd say green over here, light green. So it starts with northern Shumi. It goes further southwest into the eastern portions of Zalizhnia. And I'm not even being generous here. It should extend even further northwards into this slag heap and into parts of Pivnishnya over here. And then looking further southwest, it also extends into most of Zalizhnia, whether it be under Russian or Ukrainian control at the moment. And so the Russian vector of attack just consistently continues being through the highest elevated points in this region. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the Russian forces are trying to solidify control over these particular hills in order to overlook certain frontline positions that the Ukrainians still maintain on their southern flank, for instance, in this region over here, or for instance, in New York itself, or any of the hinterlands where there are a lot of fortified structures that I don't know how well manned they are anymore because there are more pressing areas to defend, but they are now very exposed in the regions that the Ukrainians put a lot of effort into building up over 10 years to try to make them impregnable from a direct assault. And now they're not going to be directly assaulted. They're going to be flanked from the north and overlooked from suburbs that were previously under a very safe Ukrainian control. And that just puts a wrench in any sort of long-term resistance in these regions. As I said in previous videos, they really are being rendered superfluous. And so just once again, this shows us that the 32nd Brigade is getting very active in this region. I think they were operating around the Kupiansk region off the top of my head. And they do have a rather notable tank component, which has made itself known, trying to fire directly into houses where Russian soldiers are just trying to be the vanguard of the offensive. And looking at a more granular perspective, you can see the Russians are now very close to this northern flank of the trenches of Pivdenia. Pivdenia is very interesting because there are so many quarries and slag heaps, and so the geography is really wild regardless of which side controls it. And being able to very quickly really divert attention from the front line, from the regions that were really built up by the Ukrainians in lieu of what they expected to be a head-on assault, being able to divert a lot of, or really avoid any sort of engagements in those regions does save the Russians a lot of time, but also men that would have been expended in those sort of confrontations. But it's not like the fighting over here is not deadly. It's going on within the center of suburbs with very fierce Ukrainian resistance, attempted counterattacks, as we saw with this tank. It's not just occurring with tanks, it's also house-to-house fighting. And so it, even without directly trying to overcome trenches, it is also very difficult to advance. But you can see here two issues. The smaller issue is the fact that the Russians are now, if we measure it, about 500 meters away from the main road that bisects some of these eastern Toretsk suburbs and serves as the, I guess you could say, this central nexus of the Ukrainian line of defense. And then looking a bit further to the west, it's about 1 kilometer away from Ukraine's southern slag heap in this region. And there are two Ukrainian slag heaps that are connecting the Ukrainian line of defense that you see built in yellow over here along the main road that I discussed. It's this one in Pivnishnya to the north and then the one in Zalizhnya. And now the Russian forces are getting closer to the one to the south. Again, putting pressure on it makes it harder for Ukrainians to station themselves over there. And I guess the hope for the Russians in the end would be to take control over it for their own purposes of then overlooking the valleys on which Toretsk itself is located on. And then also looking further south, the further the Russians are able to push deep into here, the more dangerous it becomes for the Ukrainians that are located in between. And the more dangerous it becomes for whatever Ukrainian forces are trying to stabilize the situation in New York, as they would have to look out for their northeastern flank. Now looking at Makiivka, the Russian pushes here have not ended. there definitely is a concerted effort at capturing it, not just because of the village in isolation, but also because of the broader importance of crossing over the Zherebets River. I think the Russians really realized this once the Ukrainians succeeded in slightly advancing eastwards and conducting localized counterattacks in the regions east of Terany and Makiivka, which really put a wrench in Russia's plan of just month by month trying to gradually push through forested regions and tree lines to eventually reach the Zherebets River. That sort of gradual process, it really got bogged down by Ukrainian defensive efforts, and eventually they were able to turn the tide in their direction, which just gave them enough breathing space to stall the front line up until today. And so I think the Russian forces are trying to open up a new vector further north to then flank whatever Ukrainian forces are further south. But then again, it's still in its nascent stages as the Russian forces have still not controlled, not captured fully Makiivka. But we do have geolocations indicating their advance. So this is from July 12th. It's a video from the 115th Mechanized Brigade. It shows their drones dropping I think it was a mine, not a grenade, onto a Russian soldier that was in the backyard, I think, of a house near the Zherebets River, and killing him. And so in terms of the advance, based off of that, the fact that we know there's a Russian soldier even present there, it would show us a 1 kilometer advance westwards. And this means that the Russian forces are very close to this particular crossing. Apparently the bridge is destroyed from what I wrote here, but perhaps there's a pontoon or something. But it's not that important because in terms of it crossing over on foot, it shouldn't be particularly difficult. It is probably shallow, and I know for sure that it's narrow in this region. And so when you look at vehicles, it's one story, but then for just soldiers operating alone or in squads, crossing over is not difficult and it's not that time consuming. And so you do have this Russian momentum developing along this axis in southern Makiivka, which then puts questions about what's going on in the warehouses at the southern tip of the village. Then you also have the continued Russian pushes in the center over here along this formation of tree lines. And then also further north, the Russians trying to reach the northern tip of the village. And so you have several attack vectors with the Russians trying to look for a place in which it would be conducive for them to cross over the river. And I think the Ukrainians have realized what the Russians are trying to embark upon here. And now we're seeing that some reinforcements have actually been sent in to try to maintain the structure of the front line. And so you have the 115th Brigade. They were previously involved in fighting around Avdiivka, or just around Cherotine, and they were involved in a lot of the debacles around the Russian advance that allowed for the capture of Cherotine originally. And after that entire affair, which was like 2-3 months ago, we haven't heard much from them. They were still floating around the northern Avdiivka flank for a while, and then it just sort of simmered down. And now we're seeing that they finally been recommitted to a new part of the front line, which also means that the Vovcha River front has had less men committed to it now. The Russians or the Ukrainians have rediverted men away from that particular point of the front. And just as a reminder, it's basically been a year since the Russian forces attempted at exploiting a gap that they sensed in the Zherebets River region when they crossed over from Kolomichichka and captured various villages like Andriivka, Myozharivka, and further south like Nadia. So they were advancing from areas like Rahorodka, Serhivka, and they tried to essentially get control over this chain of heights over here with the hope of then overlooking various Ukrainian positions in fields and trenches that are leading all the way to Borova, which is basically right next to the Oskil River, has a crossing past the Oskil River, and all the towns that are connected to it are also running along a very low-lying river valley. And so there was an attempt at the time for the Russian forces to try to exploit that gap, and eventually it withered away because the Ukrainians were able to commit forces into the region and just stop any sort of Russian advances through forested regions and fields. And so we'll have to see if there is a different story this time surrounding the Russian advance, like 20, 30, 40 kilometers southwards in an area like Makiivka. But yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.